Yesterday afternoon we completed the section on the anthropology of desire, seeing the basis of desire as being part of our own nature in its directedness towards God. That desire for Bernard of Clairvaux is not merely an affective experience of yearning for God at the level of psychology, but is rather a fundamental ontological reality at a level which is largely pre-conscious, but which from time to time expresses itself at the level of consciousness. I had meant to leave with you a few questions for reflection on that section, but I shall give you those at the end of today's section. There's some things here. So today we're going on to the section which has this weird title, Alternation, which is, roughly speaking, the experience of the life of desire. And it's illustrated quite well, I need scarcely say, by these diagrams, and I'm sure you can all understand those, and there's not much use in my saying anything more. But I'd like, before we start to broach the notes, just to run over, just in very general terms, what Bernard means by the term alternatio, which is one that he seems to have largely engineered for himself. So, to begin with, just a general run through the meaning of what is alternation. So we begin with the idea that the spiritual journey as a dialectic, as composed of linked but opposed principles of change. That in our spiritual journey, life is not always the same. That it is composed of such things as faith and sin. That both are true realities in our life. There is faith is real. It's our attachment to God and so forth. Sin is equally as real. It is also a matter of presence and absence. Sometimes God seems present to us. We experience God as present. Other times we experience God as absent. Sometimes we are present to God, and sometimes we are absent from God. It is a matter also of mercy and judgment. Bernard will often quote Psalm 88, "My song is of mercy and judgment." Note, he says, mercy and judgment. Not mercy alone, not judgment alone, but mercy and judgment. So we're getting a series of polarities here. Hope and fear. And so this is Bernard's view of things. Therefore, both belong to the truth of human reality. Both poles are necessary for the whole reality of our present status before God to be expressed. And if both belong to the truth of human reality, then both belong to authentic experience. And in fact, Bernard gives as one of the criteria of authentic experience precisely alternation. Anybody who only experiences fear is not genuine. Anyone who only experiences love is a phony. The genuine spiritual experience is marked by alternation, by positive experience and by negative experience. As a result, if we define spirituality by the positive alone, as we are rather inclined to these days, love, peace, happiness and joy, who wants them? Well, we all want love, peace, happiness and joy, and we market our monasteries by saying they will give you love, peace, happiness and joy. And so forth. But the danger is, if we define spirituality by the positive alone, we might turn into cotton candy, or alternatively, then the advent of the negative will cause confusion. All right, you tell people, our way is a way of peace, our way is a search for God, it's love, it's this, it's that, it's the other thing. And what does a person feel then when things start to go wrong? What does somebody think is happening in their lives when they start to have strong fears, a strong sense of judgment, a realization of their own sinfulness. Well, they get very, very confused, they lose their nerve, they begin to panic, and so forth. But on the other hand, I've got another line here, which jeopardizes faith and perseverance. I have assisted at the obsequies of a number of people who have simply panicked at this point in life. When, to use the old cliche, it's not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. When the positive oozes out of life and they begin to move into a negative phase of life, suddenly everything changes and they begin to panic. And if they haven't had the right instruction, which is why John of the Cross curses spiritual directors who are ignorant, if they haven't had the right instruction, then they begin to panic. They become very anxious and they may very quickly pass the point of no return, simply because nobody has told them the secret ways of the spiritual life, so to speak. Nobody's told them that negativity and negative experience is a part of total human experience, and it certainly stamps itself on our spiritual journey. On the other hand, if we only accept the negative, if the only real things are suffering and pain and death and darkness, and these are the things that we like to talk about, and well, then we've got problems. If we only accept the negative, we become unfeeling and grim. It's just a matter of we can't trust your own feelings, we deny feelings, we say stick to the rule, do the things that used to work, carry on, and so forth, and everything becomes hard and everything becomes very rigid and unfeeling. And a great danger results from that. So the problem, what we have to do is first of all to accept both aspects of our own spiritual journey, both the positive and the negative, and to accept them as normal. And if somebody comes in all sunshine and sunbeams and flowers, well, you can say one of two things. A, he or she is a phony, or B, things will soon change. And it's as simple as that. So the problem that we're really facing is the problem of change in life. And not only change, but change which is unpredictable. In one sense, you can never really warn people about this. You can never really say, you won't be able to, you'll be able to cope with this and just push this button when this happens. Because when the negative starts to assert itself in life, it's always at the very wrong place and at the very wrong time, and just when we're not able to cope. It points, it pushes its finger like a doctor with a rupture or something like that when somebody's had a fall. Pushes his finger right in the place where it hurts. Gets through all our defenses. So the change that comes with life is unpredictable. It's uncontrollable. It's not understood, and it's very painful. So we're being asked to confront a life which changes, and changes in a way which is beyond our control, which is beyond our comprehension, and which causes us much suffering. And as a result, we're being asked constantly to head into unknown regions. And so we have to see if we can get all this on the screen. As a result, we have to say that the sort of faith that will enable us to live a monastic life is real faith, is accepting to live in a state of unknowing, persevering in hope, in a faith and a hope that doesn't see. And so this is the general area. We're going to say all this at least 17 times before we finish this section. But this is just the first run through. This is what Bernard means when he talks about alternation. What do you think about desire for God? Who wants desire for God? Well, it seems like a very nice reality. It's a charming reality, and we can write lovely books about it. But at the same time, if it's a human reality, it must be marked by both positive and negative features, which means that there is a counterside to desire for God, as there is to every other spiritual reality. And so we're liable, even in our experience of desire, to be surprised. We're liable to be challenged, to be asked to extend ourselves. Let's just read the first page of this text, which covers a number of these points. If anybody wants these longer transparencies, we can always get them copied to save you writer's cramp. It's just to throw them up there rather than to have you disturbing your slumbers by keeping you writing. So the Western Church, particularly after the time of Augustine, was powerfully aware that spiritual growth takes place within the context of a dialectic in which the predominantly negative experience of the destructive power of sin is pitted against an effective, faith-inspired involvement with heavenly realities. The first demands discipline and effort from the Christian. The second calls him to cease from toil and to devote himself entirely to trusting restedness in God. So there is something about our life which calls us to rest in God and to do nothing, but there is also something about our life which involves us to engage ourselves in the spiritual combat. Because it's not only a matter of keening after the ultimate realities and yearning for them and stretching out towards them, but it is also a matter of combating the continuing effect of sin in our life. And this is where it's useful for us to look at this masterpiece of art. This is your life. If I can avoid myself getting... It goes through approximately 3 phases. Don't hold me too closely to the division, or why it happens where it does. The first is the phase of sin. The second is the phase of grace. And the third is the phase of glory. If you're very clever, you probably will be able to guess that blue means predominantly a sinful life. A life in which sin is almost predominant, in which aversion from God is the main feature of life. Grace is pretty well 50-50, half sin and half glory, but in the early stages it's more sin, and in the later stages it's less sin. Whereas glory is progressively a total stretching forth of ourselves to God. Totus periget in Deum. Wholly, he plunges himself he into God. That kind of thing that St. Bernard talks about. And so it's important that we understand that wherever we are in the spiritual life, and most of us are probably in the phase of grace, with 1 or 2 exceptions, who are about to make a start any day now, we're in the stage of grace, and in which we can experience in ourselves both the power of sin and the power, a heavy attraction into glory. And it's a little bit like this. We'll develop this one later on. It isn't a little bit like that at all. In which, if you take a cross-section of our life, somewhere around the middle here, you would see that it's made up of 2 things. It's made up of sin pushing in on us, and what is sometimes referred to as concupiscence, the effects of past sins, the habits, the imaginations, the feelings, the expectations, are continually pushing in on us. Even though we may have passed to some extent beyond the control of sin, it's still about 50-50. And on the other hand, we are drawn out by the desire for God, by the desire for heavenly realities, by our movement towards God, which is taking up part of our will. Our will has assented in part. So when we talk about a cross-section, we're saying that looking at this, looking at my experience, I may find that it's about half the experience of sin, my being away from God, my being separated from God, and about half my experience of being drawn to God. The same proportion, so to speak, is reflected in my prayer, if I'm faithful to prayer. So that when I go to pray, half the time I'm away from God. I'm with the birds, I'm at the races, I'm somewhere else, I'm 1,000 miles away or 12,000 miles away maybe. I'm measuring myself for a mitre or all sorts of things, but I'm certainly not with God. But on the other hand, sometimes, and incidentally we won't get to talk about this, one of the most important words in the Western mystical tradition is sometimes. Nearly always when you get a mystical text being introduced with some reference to experience, all the way up from Cashin, you get the word sometimes. You know, life is a drag and we've got to fight the vices, but sometimes the heavens open and so forth. You often, just at the beginning of all these things, we find this little phrase. But sometimes we find ourselves powerfully drawn to God. Not of our own volition, not because we've cooked up a good recipe for prayer, but simply we find in ourselves, in our hearts, a prayer that only wants to get out. And this, proportion between our life and our prayer is largely what determines or is the result of where we are on this kind of gradation. Perhaps I should put a little arrow in here to indicate that this is the direction of travel, for those of you who might think you're going the other way. That's the direction of travel. So, sin, grace and glory, the three phases of the world according to Augustine, taken up very largely throughout the West. And we live mainly in the age of grace. But sin still exerts a power on us, but at the same time, progressively, as we go on in our journey, we're becoming more and more aware of the attraction of grace, the attraction of heavenly things. It's important to affirm that both poles are necessary, both types of experience. So we have two types of experience. A negative experience, we don't want to find sin in ourselves. We don't want to discover that we are still sold out to sin very largely, that we are victims of negativity. But that's part of our experience. And on the other hand, that's good news. But it's important to affirm that both poles are necessary if progress is to occur. To eliminate either is to court disaster. Fear and hope are two complementary means by which the soul makes progress, the one inspired by the prospect of judgment, the other by a recognition of the power and scope of God's mercy. But both are based on truth. This objective dialectic, keyword is objective, it's not something that just because I feel that way I have mood swings, I need to have my hormones or my biochemistry adjusted or something like that. No, it's an objective dialectic at the level of the will. This objective dialectic causes a variation in experience. And if it doesn't cause a variation of experience, then you're dead. It's as simple as that. If you go for a walk in your birthday suit out in the snow, you should feel cold because that's the way things are. And if you don't feel cold, it doesn't prove that you're a superior being. It just proves you've got no sense, no feeling, and that you're probably already dead. And if it's a hot day, you should feel the heat. But just as with our bodily senses, so with our spiritual senses, we should feel sometimes that there is sin in our life and that sin still exercises a very real command and control over us. and act accordingly, and at the same time sometimes we should feel the other attraction. This objective dialectic causes a variation in experience, which Bernard often terms vicissitudo, as it often occurs in the prayers of the Leonine Sacramentary in the Missal. It's one of Leo's words, vicissitudo, the changeableness. You have a turn of this and a spell of that. And we have it in Constitution on 46, on formation. What used to be 46, I don't know what it is now. But it says that the main object of formation is to gear people to cope with changing in life. The fact that life is going to change. It's not to set them up in a sweet shared fantasy system of the novitiate so that everything is going to remain like a glass house, but rather to set them up to cope with inevitable change. Vicissitudo, or the other one that we find in Odo of Cluny, alternatio. But I've been chopping around looking for precedents for this, and I find it very, very difficult. The Thesaurus Linguae Latinae has almost nothing on these words. So it seems that Bernard's usage is one that he largely either developed for himself or developed perhaps second-hand, but not much more than that, because it's not very common. Bernard recognized that such subjection to variation was an inherent necessity in spiritual growth granted the present economy of body and soul. It's not due to external forces accidental to the person, nor, contrary to feelings of false guilt, to subjective disposition, history and omissions. Sometimes when things start to go wrong and our life begins to stink a bit, we say, oh, if only I had a different abbot, I'd be all right. Or if only I got a different job, or something like that. It's not according to external conditions entirely, although it can trigger off something sometimes. And it's not just simply my own private subjective history, but this is part of everyone's journey. We all begin back here as children of wrath. At our baptism, that's what we're regarded as. And we begin to gradually make progress from being children of wrath to children of God. And if our experience accurately reflects the real state of our being, then our experience should also be dual. On the one hand, an experience of dread and fear and negativity. On the other hand, desire, aspiration, yearning, and positive feelings. It is Bernard's firm teaching that alternation between positive and negative experience is a universal law of spiritual growth. The only way that you can protect yourself against it is to repress one or other aspect. And if you repress it, it will go sour and eventually explode. More than this, the absence of such change is viewed by him with suspicion. It gives ground for the presumption that such an even life is inauthentic and subject to substantial delusion. And being on the road, you meet people like that who say that everything's fine, everything's going terrific, things couldn't be better, I'm as happy as Larry, and so forth. And you wonder if they'll be there next time you come round. But it's a very dangerous state to be in, just as it's dangerous to say, oh, everything's wrong, and so forth, and so forth, and so forth. Authentic experience should reflect our actual status, according to the mix, according to where we are. It may be that we only have one good prayer a year. Well, that means that we're way back here. Well, that's all right. That's good, because if that's what we are, then that's going to save our life. That's authentic kind of thing. Because there's nothing better for us if we're in a bad state than to experience that state, experience the danger of things. We'll come back on this about 1,000 times, so don't worry. The theoretical foundation of Bernard's teaching is to be found in the essential changeableness of the existence in the flesh. The thesis is well stated by Augustine. This is one of De Consensu Evangeliorum. Whoever thinks that in this mortal life a human being may so disperse the mists of bodily and carnal imaginings as to take possession of the unclouded light of changeless light in such a way, that should be the unclouded truth of changeless light, in such a way that he may cling to it with extraordinary and unswerving constancy of spirit. Such a one understands neither what he seeks nor the one who seeks it. Now get that last line. A person who is totally convinced that everything is fine and that the whole spiritual life is really very easy. I've been here nearly 2 weeks, and I've been trying, and monastic life is a cinch. There's no problems with monastic life. I've kept it going for 2 weeks, and just look at me. Well, Augustine says, such a one understands neither what he seeks. What we seek is way above our league. It's way above our head. It's transcendent. And so if we think it's going to be, we can just have a few little tricks, and that allows us to capture the transcendent like a butterfly in a net, well, we're completely deluded. We don't understand that this is God that we're dealing with. It's a God beyond human experience and all aspirations, and it's even presumptuous to try and seek him. And to say, well, I went to the monastery and sought God and found him, and after 2 weeks, well, got sick of it then and left. But you can't find God in 2 weeks. Later on we'll say, St. Bernard says, contemplative life means living wholly for Christ and doing it for a long, long time. So we can get into the monastery and go, I've arrived here, I love Christ, nothing else means anything more to me. That's fine. Do it for another 20 years and you'll find yourself a contemplative. Do it for another 40 years and you'll be back where you started. Do it for another 60 years and you really will be contemplative. But it's not an easy thing, and you don't know what you seek. If you think monastic life is a cinch, it's a couple of little tricks, and the seniors, should wake up to themselves, because I can see very clearly 15 things each of them will do. I'll sit down and write prescriptions for everybody in the community. I can see what's wrong with him and her. And, the whole thing is all very, very simple at times, unless you've had real experience, and particularly unless you've really struggled with the deep, dark side of yourself. Then you're writing prescriptions for everybody else, and you've got no concept of what the whole show is about. Such a one understands neither what he seeks nor the one who seeks it. Doesn't understand himself or herself. So that's Augustine, and we're just going to race through a summary of Bernard's teaching now, and before we start looking at texts. And this is really, this is adults only. Anybody under 21 should leave. Kate? Because this is really adult doctrine, and Bernard eventually says this, that this is for the mature. It's not the obvious thing, and that's why it's so worthwhile, because you don't find it very often. Let's have a look at it. In the movement of the soul towards God, it's possible to anticipate a dual stream of experience. On the one hand, there are moments of pleasure and relief in which God seems very close and progress assured. One of the classical words for that is respiratio, taking a breath. All right, life is a bit of a struggle, and for some of us it's a lot of struggle a lot of the time. But using Abbot John Chapman's phrase, God always gives breathing spaces, gives us chance to catch our breath. So there is always an element of respiratio, in which God seems very close and progress assured. But such moments of spiritual exaltation are relatively rare and do not last long. Rara ora et parva mora. For the bulk of his life with God, the human being experiences nothing but the heaviness of his own nature and the labour and toil of spiritual endeavour. Joy in doing good is not the norm, especially at the beginning. Reason and faith and the fear of the consequences of acting differently are the more usual motivations. Now, Bernard has something rather good on this whole thing. he talks about 3 phases of our experience, and we've got three phases of growth. We've got them here. What it's like at the beginning, and what it's like in the middle, and the end here. And he says, well, what is called for at the beginning? All right, I'll ask you. Is there a Bernard among you? What would you say is called for? Is somebody at this stage, or even earlier? What sort of thing would characterize his experience and would be typical and really authentic kind of thing? Sorrow for one's sin. That's part of it. Yeah. And to see if we can get Bernard's own words, but that's certainly part of it. Therefore, we'll say therefore. If you're repenting of sins, what's the bottom line, practically speaking? Conversion, compunction, yeah. Tears, that's at the level of experience, at the level of practicality. Penance, yeah, we're getting there. Yeah, that also, but talking about what do you do? Labour, we're getting there. What sort of, you ask the old ones, what sort of penance and labour on a Friday morning? In the good old days. Discipline. So the first stage, Bernard says, of the spiritual life, disciplina. I'll leave it in Latin because it means more than willpower and trying. It means a learning process, from discere. In other words, being prepared to learn. Disciplina, being prepared to work hard, being prepared to be under masters and mistresses, being prepared to be told what to do. Because really you're pretty light on wisdom. You need somebody to give you guidance and direction. So the first stage is disciplina. In the beginning, the ways of godly living are foreign and strange, correct? When we come to the monastery, or when we start our spiritual journey, and they don't always coincide, but the ways of godly living are foreign and strange. You know, we're not at home with them. It's like being in a strange country. They have to be learned from others learned from others and practiced with much willpower and without full comprehension. One lives under an external master, sub regula velabate. So the beginning of our life, and this could be 20 years, it could be even more, it could be less, but it means being prepared to knuckle under a heteronomy, as Kant would say, under the law that comes from outside. Because if we're just doing fundamentally playing it as it is and letting it all hang out and so forth, most of it's going to be pretty rotten stuff that comes out. Occasionally we do have our flowers that grow in the garden, but most of the stuff that'll come out of a person who's constructed like that is going to be pretty rotten. It's going to be more marked by sin and selfishness than that person perhaps realizes. And the resulting thing is that instead of strengthening the positive aspects, it's just going to allow the negative things. Usually they're disguised. So somebody who used to work in a concentration camp doesn't keep killing people and whipping people after they enter the monastery, but they have other ways of satisfying the same unhealthy instincts. You know, they're disguised. They get themselves appointed to the Liturgy Commission, and they manage. I've been on it for 20 years, so don't worry. They crucify people in various other ways in the monastery. So that's the danger. In a person like that, he reads a very advanced book or looks at the older monks and says, gee, you know, I'd love to live. You know, I've come to the monastery. I'd love to live, you know, just let it be, let it all hang out, and I'm now all spiritual. Look at me. Look at me in the nice haircut and the habit and all. I'm a changed man, I swear it. And but in fact, actions, although heavily disguised with a frosting of piety, are still the same rhythms, selfishness, self-centeredness, domination, all those various vices that we had before come out now with a little drop of sugar or maple syrup. And so, if you're going to grow at all, if you're going to learn in any sort of honesty, then you need discipline. Not being whipped necessarily, although St. Benedict says if they've got no nous, whip them. But make sure that they don't just live from their own vices, because they're going to reinforce them. In the beginning, the ways of godly living are foreign and strange. They have to be learned from others and practiced with much willpower. So you've got to actually try under the direction of another, with much willpower and without full comprehension. I don't really know why I do this, or what do I have to do this stuff for, you know? Well, we don't always understand. You know, why can't I go off and so forth? One lives under an external master, sub regula velebate. Secondly, I nearly gave the game away. Second phase, about middle life. What are you living from? Nobody cheats, I hope. What sort of thing? When you've been living fairly good and you've been, but gradually the spiritual has been strengthening, what's the normal thing that would help to moderate our life? Haven't you got there yet?
Constancy.
Constancy? Yeah, well, can you give me another word for those? That's all right, but just think about it. What is constancy? Yeah? Perseverance, yeah. And what is that, in fact? Stability, yeah, the same word, but what does that mean in practice? Yeah, virtue, keep on. What's virtue? Any scholastic theologians here? It's strength, yeah. Virtus is strength, but why is it strength, and how do you get virtues? It's a habitudo, right. First of all, it's a habit of... How do you get the habit? By practice, by the repetition of virtuous actions. Viva Aquinas, you know? A habit a virtue is a habit of of good actions. And so, but they don't use that language, they use the language of nature. It becomes second nature. It's the same we find in Augustine, we find it in the 7th chapter of the Rule of St. Benedict. We get a second nature. De Musica has got a very good definition of that 7:7. I remember the quote, but I can't remember the definition. As time goes by, as they say in Casablanca, values and beliefs are internalized, so that godly living stems from an inner source. That word internalized is a ruler word you'll recognize. Stems from an inner source, good habits, virtues, or second nature. We get an inner strength because we've been stabilized. We're starting to persevere by doing individual action good. Now, we do our scales, and eventually we get nice, muscly fingers. And so we can play, and we know where the notes are, and we know how to open the piano and all sorts of things like that. But we build up our strength through practice. And the second phase of our life is simply this, is natura. From disciplina we go to natura. And natura is a much nicer sort of life, isn't it? Because we've been changed. Whoops, I think I better put it that in Latin. Otherwise I'll be in trouble. It's a much easier way of life because I've been changed by the gradual wearing down of my faults and the exposing of my illusions, and through self-knowledge and feedback from others, I've really grown. And so, in a much more way, originally I think I intended to do that about 2/3 rather than half. But don't worry too much about the proportions. But that gradually and progressively I come to live from nature. I come to live from second habits. And so things get a bit easier. St. Benedict says monastic life is rotten at the beginning. It's so narrow because you're all boxed in. But later in, he says, you get wider, and then your heart itself expands. And so what's the third stage then? Anybody up here can tell us what's it characterized by? Richard, I think you're probably there already. He's a fast mover. We were all saints when we were postulants. Well, what? See if you can be as adventurous as Bernard. When you really, what is a real saint? He's divinized. He's in the process of divinization. But yeah. But how does he feel about good works? Does he need much discipline, or is he simply acting from habit, or what's the basis of action? Do you think? He does it through love. Okay. What's he feeling? Joy. Abandonment, yeah, to some extent, but I think I'd like to develop the joy thing a bit more. Give us a few other words for joy. Delection. Very good. Delectatio. He actually likes it. I mean, he did it in the novitiate because his novice master was breathing down the back of his neck. He does it in middle age because, well, we've always done it that way. It doesn't make any difference. But later on, he does it because it's a source of pleasure for him. And this is very important for Augustine, the whole role of delight. The only way that we really go to God is through delight. My novice master repeatedly told me you catch more flies with a spoonful of sugar than with a bucketful of vinegar. I never tried catching flies with a spoonful of sugar, but sweet things are attractive. And so when we get in the way of delectatio, in fact, that's the way God leads us. We have become so spiritual as to be able to enjoy God. Now, it's a little bit like beer. On the 9th of July 1949, I had my first taste of beer. I was 7 years old at the time, and it was my sister's wedding, and after the reception, we had a post-reception reception at our place, and there was quite a lot of beer floating around, among other things, and I decided to liberate some, partly to see what it was like, partly to shock my older brother, which was a full-time job. But so I duly carried it off in triumph and sat down to start drinking it. But to my strange surprise, I didn't like it. It was very, very bitter. And being an extremely persevering young child, as I am today, I went off and got some sugar and put it in. And did that twice, and it still didn't help. So I decided that I would just leave it back, and I think somebody else drank it afterwards, much to their surprise. But the point is, why is it that now I'm able to drink beer, whereas before I haven't? I wasn't. I didn't like it at all. The beer hasn't changed. What's the conclusion? I've changed. I've developed the taste, yeah. Now, how do I develop the taste? Practice! But not only practice, growing up is the other thing. Just growing up, when you're a child, you have more taste buds for sweet things in your mouth, which seem to fade with the adult. But growing up and practice is the thing. And what seemed to be terribly bitter is now, it's still bitter, but it's bitter, it's good. Melbourne bitter, nothing better. I won't sell any more beer, but see, it's the same as going into a dark room. You think it's very dark, but gradually your eyes accustom and you see more and more detail. And it's not the reality that's changing, it's us. And so what's happening is that at the beginning, spiritual life is very, very bitter. It's hard work, it's hard discipline. It's characterized, if it's an authentic spiritual life, it's characterized by fear and dread, recognition of just, whew, that was a close shave, you know, we just got in, and so forth. Progressively, it becomes more easy, not totally easy, but we kind of feel that we're going along the way and that most of our horses are happily trotting in the right direction, at least all of them some of the time, some of them all of the time, and occasionally there are problems, but you know, generally we're settled. And so the third stage is the strange word that Bernard uses is gratia, which means gratification. Huh? Doesn't mean grace. And a lot of people try and explain this disciplina natura gratia, and they get terribly tangled up simply because gratia means pleasure, can mean pleasure. Huh? Let's just read the words of the oracle here before we go and have some other sorts of pleasure. As one approaches perfection, godly living becomes more and more pleasurable. There you go, pleasurable. Thomas Aquinas says the sign of a virtuous act is that it brings us pleasure. That instead of forcing myself for the hope of merit to pick somebody up off the floor, I do it out of a real love and compassion for them, and I must admit it gives me pleasure. Huh? That means that I've been transformed. It's no longer an inconvenience, but I feel good about it. As one approaches perfection, godly living becomes more and more pleasurable. It's no longer a matter of constraint or good habits. One has been transformed so that now the good is also the desirable. In the beginning, the good is not so desirable. Theoretically it is. But we want lots of other things as well. But clicks are starting going everywhere. We might have a little break now and come back to some more pleasurable conferences afterwards.